Chapter 29. Thursday morning. When Doreen woke up the next morning, she was relieved she'd slept so well and so long, even with lingering fears of her house burning to the ground in the middle of the night. She made coffee, checked her time, and would leave soon to see Annette. Doreen had to drive, which meant locking up the animals again. Annette had wanted to see them, but Doreen wasn't prepared to take them to the hospice without prior permission from the management. She could easily bring them on a second visit. She set the alarm and escaped, hating the long sad looks from the animals. Particularly Muggs, who often got to come with her more than the other two. At least the media appeared to have completely disappeared now. If she could only stay out of trouble, they might not return. Finally clear of the cul-de-sac, she drove the few miles to the hospice. Along the way, Doreen wondered how to open this conversation and how to get the answers she needed without upsetting a very sick woman, but there was no way to know beforehand. She'd just have to dive in. She walked into the front entrance and checked what room Annette was in. With the correct room number, Doreen followed instructions and knocked. When the voice called out, "Come in," Doreen stepped inside to see a woman who looked like she'd had her heart and soul taken away from her, and she was totally done for. Doreen smiled and said, "I'm Doreen, the bone lady." Annette smiled. "I'm Annette. Although you're not a priest, I do feel like I need to have a moment to confess to somebody. All I ask is that you don't share this information until after I'm gone." Knowing that would be damn hard to do since the information could save a life, Doreen said, "I agree." She could only hope, and she hated thinking about that Annette wouldn't stay long in this world. Annette seemed to read her mind. "Not to worry. I won't be around in a few days anyway." Doreen sat down and turned on the recorder. "I'm sorry to hear that. But I understand how facing that can make us have regrets." Annette nodded. "Okay. What is it you'd like to tell the world?" "I, Annette Helmsman," the woman started, her eyes closed, "of sound mind and a failing body, am giving a dissertation on my life and all the problems of my past. I was part of the Devil Riders gang out of Kelowna when I married my husband. Although he was part of the gang too, I hadn't realized just what that life would bring. But I was a willing cohort and agreed to the lifestyle, despite it being rough and not all of it to my liking. We'd only been married 8 years when he was killed in a house fire. My life changed afterward. I was still part of the gang and was looked after to a certain extent, but I no longer belonged to anyone in particular and was passed around until I could find another partner. I didn't know how to leave the gang, and I didn't know how to exist in that new world without my partner, so I just survived until something changed so that I could get out of the gang. But getting out of the gang didn't happen until almost 20 years later, and since then, over these last 2 years, my life has been a lot easier. But that's also when my body decided to turn on me from the years of abuse. I have pancreatic cancer and do not expect to live out this week." She fell silent for a long moment. Doreen didn't know if she should prompt Annette or just let her words flow. Finally, Annette picked up the pace. "My husband's gang brothers wanted retaliation for his death. They were adamant that his death was caused by another gang that had moved into the area. They murdered men and then burned houses to the ground of 4 separate families. Yes, before you ask, all of them were members of the other gang. I don't know the names of the men or of their wives." Her voice became faint. "Years later, I understood how life was different if you weren't part of the gang like that. For my part in those killings, I know there is no asking for forgiveness." "What was your part in those killings?" Doreen asked, trying to keep the conversation flowing yet shocked at what she heard. "I drove one of the getaway vehicles," she said. "I knew what they were doing as they headed in. I knew the women would be spared, but that's about all." "You were in a biker gang," Doreen said, hesitating, "so why did you drive a car?" "So that nobody knew it was a gang hit," she said. "Who was responsible for killing these 4 men?" Our gang leader. Annette gasped for breath. T-Bone. And his 2 lieutenants, Red and Manny. Did you see them kill these men? She shook her head, or tried to. No. But I drove those 3 men each time to the houses of their 4 victims. All these fires were relatively close together, Doreen said. Why? There was one a week for 4 weeks. Every Monday. Because T-Bone wanted their victims to start the week off hating what was to come. Doreen didn't understand that thinking, but there wasn't a lot she could say about it. How were the men killed? They were? No, she stopped, looked confused for a moment, and then said, they were stabbed in the gut. Soft tissue not to nick the bone. Then their bodies and their houses were lit. And the women, where were they? They were all told to get out of town or to face the same consequences. For that matter, so were the men. But they didn't believe it. And they didn't listen. But then to walk out of town would have made them look like cowards. So of course they couldn't. And the women were all paid afterward. Why? Because the Devil Riders gang knew they would make trouble otherwise. But how does that work? You said the women were with the gang and that made them part of it, whether with the Devil Riders or the rival gang, right? So why did your gang care about their livelihood afterward? That was Steve's idea. The Devil Riders fought it for a long time. And then decided, what the hell? Particularly when they found out one of the women was pregnant. They figured the woman, once giving birth, would want more money, or would want retaliation of her own. Annette gave a half a snort that ended up closer to a cough. Steve gave me money too, but it wasn't enough to rebuild a new life outside of the gang. Doreen winced. I'm sorry to hear that. Do you know where any of the women went? No, Annette said, her voice strained. The agreement was that they were to leave town and to never be seen again. All Doreen could think of was how convenient that was. And is there anything else you need to make peace with? She asked Annette. Only that I'm sorry for everything I had to do with it, she said. Life wasn't easy back then. I did anything I could to survive. And it was a far cry from the life I finally had when I was away from the gang. But now all my sins have caught up with me, and my body is making me pay. I'm sorry, Doreen said. It can't be easy for you. The woman shook her head. No, it's not, she whispered. But I have come to understand some of it. Then her voice fell silent. Doreen waited for her to say something else, but the woman's eyes slowly closed and her breathing deepened. Doreen shut off the recorder and stood, then snuck out of the room. As she left, she whispered, I'll call you later. She walked out to the front hall. She smiled at the receptionist and said, Thank you. Annette is sleeping again. Good, the woman said. She didn't want her painkillers this morning, so she could talk to you. How long does she really have? 5 days maximum, the receptionist said. But her will is strong. Honestly, we all thought she'd be dead a few weeks ago, but something was bothering her. Hopefully whatever she wanted to discuss with you has helped. I hope so, Doreen said with a gentle smile. I can't think of anything worse than going to the grave carrying secrets that terrify you. Is there any chance I could bring my pets down here if I come back? Annette did ask me to bring them this time. The receptionist shook her head. Sorry, it's against our policy. They'd have to be registered therapy animals. She thanked the woman and walked out into the morning sun, feeling almost a dirtiness from the confession. She got in her vehicle and drove home. Something about seeing life from another perspective and realizing how unhappy the woman had been, and how ravaged she was by her disease, made Doreen grateful for the life she had with Nan and her animals. She pulled into her driveway, used her automatic door opener to open the garage, and drove her car in. She smiled as she got out, then closed the big double door and walked to the kitchen door but realized she had locked the door with a chair. Groaning, she had to let herself out of the big door, closing it again using the keypad, and then walked around to the front door. Peering inside the big picture window to the living room, she could see Muggs going nuts because somebody had gone into the garage. Although he probably recognized the sound of her car, he didn't understand what was happening. The door opener was also a new thing to him. It was a new thing to her as well. The remote had been in the garage the whole time, but it hadn't worked until Mac had fiddled with it. And she hadn't even realized he'd done that until he handed her the remote and told her how to use it. She walked to the front door, unlocked it to shut it again, disarmed the security system, and sat down on the floor. The critters rushed to her, and she cuddled them. "When I die," she announced, "let it be fast. And let it not make you guys' life tough." When she finally gave everybody the loving they needed, she rose and headed into the kitchen to make herself a cup of tea. Something was so sad about Annette. There'd been no mention of a child, no mention of a family, no mention of anyone who cared. And even the receptionist said she didn't get many visitors. And that was even sadder. But now Doreen had something major she needed to deal with. While the kettle boiled, she opened her laptop and plugged in the recorder, hoping against hope it had worked. Then she copied it to her laptop and stored it in the cloud. After that, she listened to Annette's raspy voice. Her pain filled the kitchen. With that, Doreen copied it and sent it to her new email for safekeeping. How could she possibly not tell Mac? It wouldn't hurt anybody at this stage of the game, and it was definitely important as far as these arson cases were concerned. Just then, Mac, maybe even knowing she was thinking about him, called her. She sighed happily. "Hey," she said. "Hey," he said. "You sound different." "Yes. I just listened to a dying woman's confession," she said sadly. "It's painful, and I promised her I wouldn't let anybody else know until she passes." "Confession of what?" he asked, his voice harsh. She winced, took a deep breath, and let the words come out in a rush. "Her part in 4 murders.